be physically active, eat a good diet, don't smoke, don't drink too much, be socially connected.
Yeah.
You know the stuff that we should be doing, and we tend to run away from it a little sometimes.
Welcome to the Science Week podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Hussey, and we're delighted to be bringing you this video series that will be celebrating Science Week. Now, from the 12th to the 19th of November, there'll be events right up and down the country, so check out scienceweek.ie for more information. On today's episode, we'll be discussing the science of mental health. I'm delighted to welcome Professor of Experimental Brain Research at Trinity, Shane O'Mara. Shane, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, we're great to have you, Shane. Listen, tell us a little bit, because we hear a lot in the media about mental health, but give us some examples or talk a little bit about good mental health and bad mental health.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is that good mental health, like good physical health, is on a spectrum, and we have this kind of human cognitive bias where we like to say it's X or it's Y, but the truth is that it's actually on a spectrum. And I think a better way to think about mental health is to think about it in terms of its components. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, what we mean really is something around the idea of subjective well-being, the idea that you feel good in yourself, but critically that you're functioning well. And a third thing that people often forget is being able to cope with bad emotions and bad events. So when you unpack the idea of mental health, it's not just about feeling good, because you can feel good for all sorts of reasons that might not be good reasons. But you need to be able to function well, but also you need to have this other critical component, because bad things happen in our lives. You might have an accident, somebody might have a catastrophic illness. There are lots and lots of things that happen, and a key component of mental health is being able to cope with and adequately deal with negative emotions. So it's a kind of a three-part thing. And if thinking about it with the physical health analogy, you can function quite well despite having, for example, you might have an issue with your heart, but you can still function quite well physically if you take the appropriate measures around it. So think of it as on a spectrum rather than an all or none kind of thing.
Well, that's a good way of thinking about it, because even you mentioned dealing with bad emotions, and I guess maybe we all have those bad emotions, and I guess it's being able to deal with them better. Is there any sort of examples of having those bad emotions and maybe tools that people can use at home to?
Yeah, so the one thing that people are plagued by, and it's a problem that we have in the modern world, is the experience of anxiety. Depending on the estimates that you're looking at, anywhere between kind of 1 in 10, maybe 1 in 20 of the population are afflicted with anxiety at one time or another. And anxiety can come from a variety of sources. But one source that it can come from is what's known as excessive rumination. This is where you're chewing away on a topic, you're focused on whatever it is that is you think is a problem, and it becomes outsized in your own head. So how do you cope with that? Well, there are lots of ways of coping with it, actually. Some are physical and some are mental. So a physical way of coping with excessive anxiety is to make sure that you get regular physical activity. And we know really pretty much without doubt that one of the very best ways you can inoculate yourself against having these kinds of experiences is by keeping in regular or getting regular physical exercise, and preferably doing that in a social context, so doing it with somebody else. And that kind of brings me to the next key point, which is that social connection is absolutely vital for our mental health. So a very simple question to ask yourself is, if something goes wrong, who can I talk to? If something terrible has happened in my life, who's the first person I can ring? Who's the second person I can ring? Being able to answer questions like that and understand that actually being socially isolated is a terrible thing for your mental health is very, very important. And this is why things like helplines, like I won't name any in particular, can be so very useful, because they can give you a means of getting in quote, anonymous contact with somebody. You may not want to talk about who you are, but you may need to make contact with somebody. So people shouldn't feel embarrassed about using these means of dealing with these problems. And then, of course, when you have excessive rumination, or one of the things that happens is that you circle around and around and around a particular topic. What's happening in the brain? Well, we know what's happening in the brain is that you're getting lots of activity in brain areas that are associated with thinking about the past, the present, and the future. How do you get over that? Well, one very simple method is one that is overlooked, which is to write yourself an essay every day. Very, very simple, 10, 20, 30 lines about what's bugging you. Often what happens is that people will have an issue, but they're not able to quite put it into the context of their own lives. So there are very, very nice guidelines for kind of writing therapy online. And it turns out, at least in mild cases or maybe even moderate cases, it's something that works very well. And then I think the last thing to think about, which is really important, is that there's no stigma about going to a cardiologist when you have a problem with your heart. There's no problem going to an orthopedic surgeon when you've got a problem with your knee. We should get to a place where people stop thinking that there's a problem with them if they go and seek help for a particular issue. Maybe all you need is one visit. That's fine. But we should be feeling okay in society that people have these other kinds of supports.
So it's interesting there. So you talk about maybe writing essays for yourself every day. For someone at home that maybe slightly overawed by that, saying, I don't know if I could write that down, is writing a couple of lines each day to start with.
Just get started. It's called the Pennybacker writing exercise, and it turns out actually there's quite a bit of surprising data to support it. Now, the key thing here is that don't think that these are panaceas, okay? In many cases, the issues that you have will resolve themselves naturally. We know, for example, in the case of depression, that typically over the course of a year, at least mild to moderate cases of depression tend to resolve themselves. Anxiety is kind of a little bit different in a way because cases of anxiety can convert to major depressive disorder, but they can hang around as just a kind of a feeling of generalized anxiety. But we know that they respond very well to, in particular, cognitive behavior therapies, where you're given tools for thinking about yourself, you're given practices to engage in, like, for example, this idea of engaging in writing. There are lots of things that one can do to actively cope with these things. And I think that's the key thing is to make that decision that this is something you can do for yourself.
Yeah, and you mentioned depression there. In terms of the effect it has on the brain, you mentioned like small, mild cases perhaps can resolve themselves in the brain. I guess for people, again, sitting at home, what does the brain look like when that happens, or there's a little bit of depression, I guess, in the brain?
Yeah, so depression in the brain has been a complicated story. For a very long time, it looked like there was very little difference between a depressed brain, quote unquote, and a non-depressed brain, quote unquote. And it's probably better not to think about the brain per se. It's better to think about kind of your individual quality of life, your functional impairment, whether you're meeting the kind of criteria for depression, is there a major deviation from the way you used to be? So, for example, are you unable to get up in the morning? Are you unable to engage in self-care? Do you feel a loss of pleasure in life, that life has become washed out for you? Those kinds of things. And what you see, that the studies on the brain and depression are hard to do because you're asking people who are vulnerable because of the condition that they have to come into a lab and then have their brain scanned. But you do see some differences. You see changes in brain circuits to do with memory in particular, but also in brain circuits to do with the control of emotion. And when you do interventions like cognitive behavior therapy, these tend, it seems, to rebalance the activity in these brain circuits a little.
Okay, yeah. So is that like different then? So that's depression sort of with the brain. When people have anxiety and stuff like that, is that a different sort of effect on the brain, or how does that work?
So again, the issue with anxiety really is first of all, a lot of these things overlap with each other. Yeah. So it's very, very hard to say this is a pure case of anxiety and this is a pure case of depression. Very often they're kind of comorbid in some way. I think the risk factor for depression is anxiety. And it is the case that I'm not going to quote the particular statistic because I don't remember it exactly off the top of my head, but a certain fraction of anxiety cases will convert to major depressive disorder over the case of a year or 2 years. So, but a fraction don't and never will.
Yeah.
So this is why these kinds of conditions can be terribly complicated. I think the key thing is, though, that especially where anxiety is concerned, the interventions work for generalized anxiety disorder or phobic disorders, for example, which can be a very specific form of anxiety associated with a particular thing. And where depression is concerned, again, early diagnosis and early intervention is always the key. And this is true of the body as well. You know, if you think you have a problem developing with your heart, don't leave it. Go and get it checked out early on.
And on that, so it's hard for maybe people to identify. So you touched on, say, if you have a problem with your knee, you're gonna struggle to walk, and obviously then you'll know when to get it checked. When do people know that, okay, I'm feeling anxious a lot of the time, that perhaps this could develop to something more serious? Is there any sort of signs? We've touched on maybe being proactive about it, but say, how do people maybe see the signs that perhaps I am getting a bit more anxious?
Yeah, so this is I think a regular problem, or a really difficult problem. So, you know, if you have a problem with your knee, you can very definitely tell you've got an issue with mobility. If you're anxious about something, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, if you're walking down a dark street at night, there's little street light around and you're hearing random noises in the background, being anxious in those circumstances is actually a really good thing because it puts you on high alert. I think the problem, the thing to focus on is that the anxiety response turns off. Having acute transient anxiety, especially in situations where, you know, that you might perceive there's some danger to you, is a good thing because you're on high alert for that problem. I think the issue is that you get this acute phenomenon, the feeling of anxiety. You wake up in the morning and it's there. It's still there at lunchtime, and it's still there in the evening. So that's a chronic problem, and that's a problem that really does need a bit of help. And then you need to think about the intensity of it. You know, if you have a pain in your knee, well, taking an anti-inflammatory
could be, yeah,
it'll be fine. But if it's, you know, getting worse, so again, the thing to think about is how it's impacting on your day-to-day functioning. Yeah. Are you starting to see a decline in how you feel and how you're able to perform your job, or whatever it happens to be? If those kinds of things are there, those are kind of things to start worrying about. And that's where really you need to think about looking for some assistance.
It goes back to what you said at the start, that mental health is a spectrum, and it's all the way up. It could be how small and how people deal with it, I guess.
And I think that, you know, we should expect in our lives that we're not going to walk in this haze of happiness from birth all the way to the end. It's kind of an unreasonable thing that there will be points at which life will be very difficult, and, you know, the personal loss is a very good example. Relationship issues is another good example. There are lots and lots of examples, but it's being able to cope with that in an effective fashion is really the key.
And coping wise, and we talked about this at the start, it's the physical exercise, talking. I guess it's the
social connection. Yeah, all of those kinds of things are really important. And I think you can think about it in really kinds of two ways. One is to build your kind of resilience against what might go wrong in your life. And like I said, regular exercise, regular sleep. I haven't mentioned sleep at all, but sleep is really, really important.
And which has been talked about a lot. Like, you know, sleep experts here, and people still don't get enough, I guess. And 7 to 8 to 9.
The quality and the quantity both matter. Okay. So some people will function perfectly well with 5 or 6 hours, and that's fine if they get good quality sleep. Other people need 7, 8, 9, and you see from the various studies that there's a kind of a spectrum in terms of need, but you need to get sleep habitually, and it's one of the very best things that you can do for your mental health. Of course, the problem with sleep is that people who have insomnia are often prone to anxiety, but the good news is that insomnia responds really, really well to cognitive behaviour therapy. Because one of the problems that people have with sleep is they're lying down, and you know, if under normal circumstances you turn out your light, you should be asleep within 2-3 minutes or something like that. Some people might lie there for an hour, and they're grinding their gears. They're thinking about all of the difficulties that they have. And it's also clear now from recent studies that problems that are trivial during the day become amplified at night. because of this kind of, you've reduced all your sensory channels. You're lying there in a darkened space. It's just you and your thoughts. So in that circumstance, there are pretty good cognitive behavior therapy interventions that work better than drug therapy for sleep. They're not as widely known as they could and should be, but a good CBT therapist should be able to help with those. And generally, they're very successful. And you don't have the sleep inertia that you have the next day. Often with drug treatment, people will fall asleep.
Yeah.
And they wake up feeling groggy. And that's not what you want. When you wake up in the morning, you should wake up feeling refreshed.
Yeah, and I guess that's a common thing for people maybe during the day because there's so many things going on. Then come night, when there's, lights off, as you said, then there may be this sort of negative thoughts, I guess, come in the brain. Is there any sort of counter to that? I know there's there's
lots that you can do. First of all, the body craves habit where sleep is concerned. So when your dog is tired, what does your dog do? Goes over and lies in the corner and goes to sleep. But we'll sit there and we'll think, just watch one more episode of Modern Family. It's only 20 minutes. It'll be fine. And really, being aware of getting out of that habit. Something that's very important, and again, not terribly well understood, is the relationship between sleep, wake, and light. So if you want to get to sleep reliably at night, a good thing to do, paradoxically, is to expose yourself to bright light in the morning. Because that kicks off a whole set of changes in the brain to do with alertness. It resets your circadian rhythm. It does a whole load of generally positive things. And the other side of that is that at night, you should be turning the lights down. You shouldn't be going to bed in a room that's overheated. One of the things that your body does when you're trying to sleep is it dumps heat. And if you track somebody's their temperature as they're sleeping, they typically lose about 1 degree to 2 degrees C over the course of the night. That drops down, and you've often, I'm sure, or many of your listeners will have had the experience of waking up feeling cold in the middle of the night. It's not necessarily to do with your eiderdown or whatever on your bed. It's because your body itself has lost heat. Probably in this case, too much heat has been lost. But getting that temperature down, keeping the lighting down is really important at night. If you think back to our caveman ancestors, they didn't have artificial light. They went to sleep when it got dark. And that's the way we and all other species are built. Yeah. Get the lights down. I often think a trick for people, I don't have any data on this, this is just my anecdote on this, is if you find it difficult to go to sleep at night, try lowering the temperatures. Don't overheat yourself, but go outside in the dark for a short walk for just a couple of minutes. Expose yourself to the starlight and just put yourself in a condition where general ambient light is gone down a lot. That's telling your brain it's time to hit the sack.
Yeah. What I'm picking up just from talking to you is maybe this might just be me personally, but I feel like I'm underestimating the power of the brain in dealing with a lot of these issues. So you mentioned sleep, mental health, depression. And I guess people at home, it's understanding that the brain is a very powerful tool and we need to control it maybe is probably the best way of putting it.
Well, put it like this. Does your heart know it's a heart? Of course not. Yeah. The amazing thing about our brain is that it's the one organ in our body that knows it exists.
So it's the boss.
It's the boss, and it's aware of its own existence. And we can, through small and large interventions that you can read about them in various books or whatever, we can make life much better for ourselves because we have this amazing capacity for self-awareness. But the problem is implementing it. Get yourself a checklist. Don't try and remember things. It's too hard. Just tick things off. Use an app if you want to, whatever it happens to be. But sleep hygiene, all those kinds of things, they're straightforward enough, but you just need to make them a habit.
Yeah, little small things like
small changes. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned books. One of them I was interested in is In Praise of Walking. You talk about a line in terms of mental time travel. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one of the amazing capacities that we have as humans is we can travel forwards and backwards in time just using memory and imagination.
Again, it goes back to the brain.
And exactly. And a part of the brain called the hippocampal formation, if you damage that part of the brain, your ability to travel forward mentally and your ability to travel back mentally is really, really dramatically blunted. So much so that in people with very severe damage to that part of the brain are referred to as living in a permanent present tense. The present moment is the moment they've got. What went just before is gone, and what comes in front of them is unimaginable. Whereas you're thinking about your week, you're thinking about your month, you're thinking maybe as far as ahead as Christmas. You might be thinking about next summer when you're going to go on holidays somewhere nice or whatever. For those people, that kind of future thinking, future-oriented thinking is lost. And similarly, you can travel back to when you were a kid in school or whatever it happens to be. They may only be able to go back a very short period of time, or paradoxically, they may be able to go back quite a distance, but they can't go back a week. So they have their earliest memories may be intact, but more recent ones are gone. So it's sometimes the experience is referred to as being episodic or living in strobe, because 1 minute you're here, the next minute you're there, but there's no transition.
And if you're walking, does that click the brain into gear in terms of not just mental time travel, but just in general in terms
So the amazing thing is that the hippocampal formation, so the brain bundles functions is probably the best way to think of it. And the hippocampal formation is activated by movement. We know this. There's a rhythm called theta rhythm, which is an electrical rhythm in the hippocampal formation, is activated by self-motion, not by... So I'm sitting on a chair with wheels. If you push me along, you wouldn't see this rhythm appear. But if I got up and walked, you'd see this rhythm appear. Turns out that theta rhythm is probably the best rhythm associated with the encoding of memories. And it turns out that the hippocampal formation is central to imagination. So I've already said if you've lost or damaged your hippocampus, it can happen for viral reasons, for example, encephalitis, or because of certain cases of dementia. You lose this ability to project yourself forwards and project yourself backwards. And when you're walking, the hippocampus is activated at this theta rhythm, and this drives activity on all sorts of other bits of the brain. So ideas that might be just bubbling below the level of consciousness suddenly get in, and they wouldn't have done previously.
Okay. And there was one thing I wanted to cover here. So obviously everyone's got a mobile phone now, and there's different 101 things a brain could be thinking at once. And we touched on obviously how important physical exercise is. One of the most important things of it, the fact that it's just single mindfulness, because I know a lot of people that would spend nearly all time on the phone, and maybe that 2 hours of sport a day is the 2 hours they have to just focus on one task versus the 101 different screens they have in front of them during the day, for example. Yeah,
so I think there's a lot of strong claims being made, and they're being made definitively that X causes Y, where this kind of issue is concerned. And I think we can't do that. It's way, way too early to say that. I think the truth is humans have always sought distraction. We drive with the radio on. We might be making a sandwich in the kitchen and the radio is on in the background, or the television is on. Or we distract ourselves with each other because we're having conversations with each other. We've always done this because in a way you can think of us as kind of infovores. We're kind of information hungry, and we're always looking to update.
If you feel like, just say you're sitting down doing a bit of like admin, you feel you're missing out on that hour if you're not listening to a podcast getting information.
Exactly. The thing there, though, is that sometimes the tasks that we have to do are just a little bit dull, unfortunately, and we have to do them.
So it's okay to do.
So it's okay to drive your level of activity up a little. You'll find, for example, a lot of writers will say, "Can't stand working at home. It's too quiet. I need a little bit of arousal." I find myself when I'm working that having a squeezy ball is a really handy thing to have in my hand, just to stop myself drifting when I'm doing something that's a little bit boring that I know that I have to pay attention to. A little bit of what's called tonic arousal is actually okay. You're not paying attention necessarily. If I asked you what the contents of the podcast were, you might say, it's just a little bit about it, and you can't really give me much detail. But the task itself that you've been performing on, you can tell me a lot about that. I might not want to know it, but that's okay.
You know enough about it. So on your Talking Heads book and the power of science of conversation specifically, what is the science of conversation? And also, obviously, we hear a lot the stigma. We're trying to get rid of the stigma of mental health, which we are, but very, very slowly, I think. What's it is always obviously good to talk, but what's the science behind that?
Yeah, so I think the kind of reason I wrote that book was to get this idea out there that one of the really amazing tricks, for want of a better phrase, that we humans have is the power of conversation. So you hear all this stuff about how we'll be merging our brains with AI and all that jazz, and that's all nonsense. That's never going to happen. We actually have this amazing way to short circuit things by sitting down and talking together.
Yeah.
And we reinvent this over and over again, and you see it at every level in society, from people in families or whatever sitting around the dinner table having a chat together, all the way up to legislative assemblies where we send delegates to deliberate and make decisions on our behalf. And we do this repeatedly, and we do it all the way up, of course, to the level of the UN and all of those things. And it's often derided as a talking shop. But the key point that I want to get across really is that talking together allows us to come to a consensus about what we think might be true. We might be wrong now. I'm not saying that what we say together is true, but we at least come to a consensus about what might be true. We can create a course of future action for ourselves, so we can decide together what we're going to do together in the future. It's probably the best means we have for collectively resetting our memories to the same point, setting our imagination in the same way, and then moving forward together. Now, we've mentioned the case of amnesia already. People with amnesia can't do this because they've no well of memories to draw on, and they've no capacity to imagine the future. And if you look at us in terms of other species, chimpanzees don't do this, even though they're very closely related to us. They don't get in a huddle and decide we're going to attack the troop down the road. And fire ants don't do it. Tigers, gazelles, any other species that you want to think about. So it's our human way of solving the problem of how we decide to act together.
I know you want to talk very briefly on COVID, but just on conversation, I feel we lost that during COVID because there was obviously no meeting up regularly, for example, in a pub. So there were almost two extremes, and this goes through all. I found extreme views got quite heightened during COVID. But COVID itself, how's that sort of impacted people's mental health, I guess?
Yeah, so I think we're still kind of getting data on this, and my sense of the current state of play is this, that for people who are able to maintain either online through telephones or just 2 meters distancing across the garden wall or whatever, that there was people came through the COVID experience reasonably well. I do think though that there's been a spike in anxiety disorder in teenagers, particularly in the kind of 13, 14, 15-year-old age group. There's quite a bit of data, especially from the US on this, but I have no reason to believe that anywhere else is any different. These are the ages when kids are making the kind of transition from their home life and their small group of friends to the transition into what is a more adult life where you meet people all the time and you're chatting with them. And they lost that experience for a couple of years. It's going to be an interesting one to look at. I don't want to say that there's a very dark prognosis there for the simple reason that we know that humans are pretty good at recovering from bad experiences, that we are a tremendously resilient species. This is how we've managed to populate the planet. But nonetheless, I do think that the focus on that age group in terms of understanding what has happened to them because of their diminished social experience is probably very important. Whereas I suspect, a newly born isn't going to have been very much aware of this, or a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, it won't have affected very much because they have a very narrow circle. They're still learning to walk, to talk, to self-care, to do all the standard stuff that you need to transition into being a functioning person.
So I want to take it back to the start when will be the first question we asked in terms of what's good mental health. If someone's listening and you wanted them to take one takeaway from this podcast, what would it be?
It's a funny one, but I actually think I would recommend focusing on sleep.
Sleep. We spoke a lot about sleep, but it's vital.
We underestimate the power of sleep, and we know that sleep disruption accompanies all sorts of psychiatric disorders and accompanies all sorts of other conditions. And we know that in many cases it precedes them. It may or may not be causal, but the suspicion is that there's so I would say sleep, but I would also say, I don't want to reduce it to one message.
No.
Be physically active, eat a good diet, don't smoke, don't drink too much, be socially connected.
Yeah.
You know the stuff that we should be doing, and we tend to run away from it a little sometimes.
And one very quick final question: is there anything that we haven't spoken about that you'd like to maybe people point in the direction of to go away?
Yeah, maybe just something that is worth emphasising a little. So humans have an amazing capacity for mind wandering. So when you put somebody in a brain scanner and you give them a task to do, so you might run a piece of text in front of them and they have to push a button every time they see the letter E. They'll focus very well on that. And then if you say to them, okay, just lie there, do nothing, what you see is a network in the brain called default mode network lights up straight away. And what's going on in that network? When you ask people, what are you thinking about? Well, they're thinking about the big picture of their lives. They're thinking about what they're going to do immediately after they get out of this dumb experiment. They're going to think about the conversation that they had last week, all of that kind of stuff. So we wander about in the privacy of our own heads an awful lot. But what we also see is that when you do large-scale sampling in the population using mobile phones, and when people are engaged in undirected mind wandering, they tend to say that they're not in shall we say, good form. That undirected mind wandering is
not good.
It tends to cause a kind of a slightly, to use a technical term, dysphoric state. Mind wandering, though, is a good thing because we do need to think about the big picture of our lives. So mind wandering around a goal is the way to go, rather than just sitting there grinding your gears, not thinking about anything in particular.
Yeah, listen, that was fascinating. Shane O'Mara, thanks a million for coming on.
Thank you so much. Delighted to be here.
Thank you. And that's it for the Science Week podcast. Check out scienceweek.ie for all those events happening across the country. Until next time, take care.